A continent divided by power, fear, and unspoken dreams. Long before the sound of muskets echoed across the land, and before declarations were written in ink and blood, America existed in a fragile balance of power and silence. The vast continent stretched endlessly, rich with forests, rivers, and untold promise. Yet beneath its natural beauty lay a society deeply divided by empire and colony, ruler and subject, hope and fear. By the early 18th century, European colonization had firmly taken root in North America. Britain stood as the most powerful colonial force along the eastern seaboard, governing 13 colonies that stretched from New England to Georgia. On the surface, British rule appeared orderly and distant. Governors represented the crown, laws were passed in the king's name, and loyalty to Britain was expected without question. But life within the colonies was far more complex than it appeared from across the Atlantic. For ordinary colonists, daily life was shaped by labor, survival, and obedience. Farmers rose before dawn to work land they often did not legally own. Artisans and craftsmen struggled to sell their goods while British regulations restricted colonial trade. Merchants faced constant oversight, taxes, and inspections that reminded them they were subjects, not citizens. Though many colonists had never seen the king, his authority reached into their homes, their businesses, and their futures. British control was built not only on laws, but on economic dependence. The colonies were expected to supply raw materials, timber, tobacco, cotton, and sugar, while purchasing finished goods from Britain. This system enriched the empire while limiting colonial prosperity. Wealth flowed outward across the ocean, leaving many colonists feeling exploited but powerless. They worked hard, yet remained trapped in a system designed to benefit another land. Social inequality further deepened the divide. Colonial society was sharply stratified. At the top stood wealthy landowners, merchants, and British-appointed officials who enjoyed privilege and protection. Below them were small farmers, laborers, indentured servants, and enslaved Africans whose lives were marked by hardship and limited opportunity. Native American tribes, the original inhabitants of the land, were steadily pushed aside, their cultures disrupted, and their territories seized in the name of expansion. Fear was a constant presence. Colonists feared poverty, hunger, and disease in an unforgiving land. They feared native resistance, slave revolts, and foreign invasion from rival European powers. Above all, they feared the invisible weight of imperial punishment. The British military presence served as a reminder that disobedience would not be tolerated. Red-coated soldiers patrolled ports and towns, symbols of authority and control. Yet despite this fear, unspoken dreams quietly began to take root. Many colonists had crossed the ocean seeking freedom from religious persecution, rigid class systems, or economic stagnation. America, to them, represented possibility. Land was more abundant than in Europe, and social mobility, though limited, felt within reach. These dreams did not yet take the form of rebellion, but they lived in conversations around hearth fires, in church sermons, and in the private thoughts of men and women who sensed that life could be more than what it was. Communication between Britain and the colonies was slow and distant, creating a gap between rulers and the ruled. Decisions made in London often ignored the realities of colonial life. Laws were enforced without understanding local conditions, breeding resentment. Colonists began to feel that they were governed by men who neither knew them nor cared to know them. Religion played a powerful role in shaping colonial identity. Churches were centers of community life and moral guidance. Preachers spoke of equality before God, planting subtle ideas that contradicted absolute monarchy. If all men were equal in the eyes of God, some quietly wondered, why were they unequal under the law? Education and literacy were also spreading, particularly in the northern colonies. Newspapers, pamphlets, and letters circulated ideas more rapidly than ever before. Though still cautious, colonists were beginning to question authority, not openly, but persistently. Knowledge became a quiet form of resistance. Despite growing tensions, loyalty to Britain remained strong for many. The empire had provided protection during wars, stability in governance, and a sense of belonging to something powerful and global. To challenge Britain seemed unthinkable, even dangerous. The idea of independence was still distant, almost unimaginable. Most colonists sought reform, not revolution. Yet history rarely announces its turning points. Beneath the surface of daily routines, forces were shifting. Each unfair tax, each ignored petition, each act of imperial control added weight to a growing sense of injustice. The storm had not yet broken, but the air was heavy with anticipation. In this world before the storm, America was not yet a nation. It was a collection of colonies bound by fear, controlled by power, and sustained by dreams that dared not yet speak their names. The land waited, its people unaware that the quiet unease they felt would soon ignite into a struggle that would reshape history forever.
How control, taxation, and injustice sparked silent resistance. The British Empire did not rule the American colonies through constant violence alone. Its most powerful weapons were laws, taxes, and systems carefully designed to keep control without open rebellion. These chains were often invisible, wrapped in legal language and royal authority, yet they pressed heavily on the lives of ordinary colonists. Over time, the weight of this control began to stir something dangerous: silent resistance. After years of war in Europe and North America, Britain found itself burdened by massive debt. The empire looked to its colonies not as partners, but as sources of revenue. From London's perspective, the solution seemed reasonable. The colonies should help pay for their own protection. To the colonists, however, these decisions felt like punishment imposed without consent. Taxes arrived one after another, each one cutting deeper than the last. The Sugar Act restricted trade and imposed duties on molasses, a vital commodity for colonial merchants. The Stamp Act followed, requiring official stamps on newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. It was not the cost alone that angered the colonists, it was the principle. For the first time, ordinary people felt the empire reaching directly into their daily lives. Taxation without representation became more than a phrase. It became a shared grievance. Colonists had no elected representatives in Parliament, yet they were expected to obey laws passed by men who had never set foot on American soil. This injustice struck at the heart of colonial identity. They were British subjects, yet treated as lesser ones. Trade restrictions further tightened the chains. The Navigation Acts forced colonial merchants to trade almost exclusively with Britain, often at unfair prices. Colonial manufacturing was discouraged or outright banned to prevent competition with British industries. Skilled craftsmen found their opportunities limited, their ambitions stifled by distant regulations. Economic freedom, once a reason for crossing the Atlantic, now felt like a fading dream. British officials enforced these laws with increasing severity. Customs officers searched ships, seized goods, and accused merchants of smuggling. Writs of assistance, general search warrants, allowed officials to enter homes and businesses without specific cause. To colonists who valued personal liberty, this intrusion was deeply unsettling. Privacy, once taken for granted, was no longer safe. The presence of British soldiers intensified tensions. Troops were stationed in colonial cities not to protect against foreign enemies, but to enforce imperial law.
Colonists were required to house and supply these soldiers under the Quartering Act, turning private homes into symbols of occupation. The red coats became a daily reminder that power rested not in local communities, but in the hands of the crown. Anger grew, but it was rarely loud at first. Resistance began quietly, carefully. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Citizens refused to buy taxed products, choosing sacrifice over submission. Women played a crucial role, producing homemade goods to replace imports, transforming domestic labor into an act of defiance. Pamphlets and newspapers became tools of resistance. Writers argued that British actions violated natural rights and long-standing English traditions. They reminded readers that liberty was not a gift from the king, but a right earned by birth. These ideas spread rapidly, whispered in taverns, discussed in churches, and debated in town meetings. British responses only deepened resentment. When colonial assemblies protested, they were dissolved. When petitions were sent to London, they were ignored. Each rejection convinced more colonists that peaceful appeals were futile. The empire's refusal to listen hardened attitudes and eroded loyalty. Tensions eventually spilled into violence. The Boston Massacre, though small in scale, had enormous impact. British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, killing several. Newspapers framed the incident as proof of imperial brutality. Images of blood on colonial streets fueled outrage far beyond Boston, uniting colonies in shared anger. Still, most colonists did not seek independence. They wanted fairness, respect, and a voice in their own governance. But the empire's rigid control left little room for compromise. Each new law, each show of force, convinced more people that reform within the system was impossible. What began as economic frustration transformed into political awakening. Colonists started to see themselves not just as British subjects, but as a distinct people with shared interests and grievances. The idea of unity, once unthinkable across diverse colonies, slowly took shape. By the time the Tea Act granted special privileges to the East India Company, resistance had matured. The Boston Tea Party was not an act of chaos, but a carefully planned statement. Disguised colonists dumped chests of tea into the harbor, rejecting both the tax and the authority behind it. It was a symbolic breaking of chains, even if the consequences were yet to come. Britain answered defiance with punishment. The coercive acts closed ports, dissolved local governments, and expanded military control. These measures were meant to restore order, but instead they united colonies as never before. What harmed one colony was now seen as a threat to all. Silent resistance had grown into open defiance. The chains of empire, once accepted as unchangeable, were now questioned, challenged, and tested. Control, taxation, and injustice had done what no speech or slogan could do. They had awakened a people. The storm was no longer distant. It was approaching, shaped by years of oppression and fueled by a growing belief that liberty was worth any cost.
The rise of leaders, thinkers, and forgotten heroes. Revolutions are often remembered through battles and bold declarations, but long before the first shot was fired, the American struggle for freedom was fought with words. Voices, some famous, others forgotten, rose from towns, farms, printing presses, and meeting halls. Together, they shaped a new way of thinking, one that no empire could silence. As British control tightened, colonists began searching not only for relief, but for meaning. They asked difficult questions. Who had the right to rule? What did liberty truly mean? These questions did not emerge from a single leader or moment. They spread slowly, carried by thinkers, writers, preachers, and ordinary citizens who dared to imagine a different future. Among the most influential voices were the intellectuals of the Enlightenment. Ideas from European philosophers, John Locke, Montesquieu, and others, found eager audiences in the colonies. Locke's belief that government existed to protect natural rights resonated deeply. If a government failed in that duty, he argued, the people had the right to resist. Such ideas, once abstract, now felt urgently relevant. Colonial thinkers adapted these philosophies to their own experiences. Lawyers, educators, and community leaders discussed them in private letters and public debates. Town halls became arenas of political thought, where farmers debated concepts once reserved for scholars. Knowledge was no longer confined to elites. It was becoming a shared weapon. Newspapers played a revolutionary role. Printing presses multiplied across the colonies, turning ink into influence. Editors published essays, editorials, and letters that challenged imperial authority. These papers did more than report events, they shaped opinion. For the first time, colonists from different regions read the same arguments, shared the same outrage, and began to feel part of a collective cause. Pamphlets proved even more powerful. Cheap, accessible, and widely distributed, they carried radical ideas into homes and taverns. None was more influential than Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Written in clear, direct language, it spoke to ordinary people rather than elites. Paine argued that monarchy was unnatural and independence was not only possible, but necessary. His words stripped away fear and replaced it with conviction. But the movement was not driven by famous names alone. Forgotten heroes filled the spaces between history's headlines. Printers risked arrest to publish forbidden ideas. Messengers carried letters across dangerous roads. Women organized boycotts, hosted political gatherings, and used their voices within families and communities to spread resistance. Their contributions rarely appeared in official records, yet they were essential. Religious leaders also played a significant role. Sermons blended faith with politics, framing resistance as a moral duty. Ministers spoke of tyranny as a sin and liberty as a God-given right. Churches became places where spiritual belief reinforced political courage. For many, faith provided both justification and strength. Public speeches transformed fear into unity. Orators stood before crowds and named the injustices people felt but struggled to articulate. Their words gave shape to anger and direction to hope. Listeners left not only informed, but inspired. Speech by speech, the idea of independence grew less radical and more inevitable. The British government underestimated the power of these voices. Soldiers could suppress riots, but they could not silence ideas. Attempts to censor newspapers and punish writers only drew more attention to their messages. Each arrest became proof that the empire feared the truth. As ideas spread, a new identity began to form. Colonists stopped seeing themselves primarily as Virginians or New Yorkers and started thinking of themselves as Americans. Shared language, shared grievances, and shared ideals forged connections across distance and difference. Unity, once fragile, grew stronger with every printed word. Resistance also took personal forms. Parents taught their children the language of liberty. Neighbors debated rights and responsibilities. Even silence became meaningful, a refusal to comply, a refusal to forget. The revolution lived not only in public action, but in private belief. These voices did not all agree. There were debates, disagreements, and doubts. Some feared chaos more than tyranny. Others worried about economic loss or social collapse. But the conversation itself was revolutionary. By the time armed conflict loomed, the colonies had already changed. Minds had been awakened. Fear had been challenged. Silence had been broken. The empire still held armies and laws, but it was losing control of something far more important, the hearts and thoughts of the people. The rise of leaders,
thinkers, and forgotten heroes proved that revolutions begin long before they are visible. They begin when voices refuse to be silenced, when ideas refuse to die, and when ordinary people dare to believe that their words can change the world. From peaceful protests to the first sparks of war. For years, the American colonies had fought the British Empire with words. Pamphlets, speeches, sermons, and petitions carried the weight of colonial anger. Resistance had been deliberate, thoughtful, and above all, peaceful. But history has a breaking point. There comes a moment when words alone can no longer hold back the pressure of injustice. In America, that moment was approaching fast. At first, protests were careful and symbolic. Colonists believed that if they demonstrated unity and reason, Britain would listen. Crowds gathered in town squares. Merchants closed their shops in protest, and citizens refused to buy British goods. These acts were meant to send a message, not ignite a war. They were disciplined displays of discontent, rooted in the belief that reform was still possible. Boycotts became one of the most powerful tools of resistance. Colonial merchants agreed to stop importing British goods, despite the economic hardship it caused them. Ordinary families gave up familiar comforts, tea, fine cloth, household items, choosing sacrifice over submission. What seemed like small personal decisions became collective acts of defiance. Yet the British government saw these protests not as dialogue, but as disobedience. Parliament responded with tighter control, convinced that firmness would restore order. Instead, each new law hardened colonial resolve. Tension filled the air in port cities like Boston, where British soldiers patrolled the streets among an increasingly hostile population. Boston had become the epicenter of resistance and repression. British troops were stationed there to enforce imperial laws, their presence a constant reminder of foreign authority. Encounters between soldiers and civilians grew more frequent, more hostile. Insults turned into scuffles, fear mixed with anger, and patience wore thin. The breaking point came one cold March evening in 1770. A confrontation between British soldiers and a crowd of colonists escalated rapidly. Shouts echoed through the street. Stones and snowballs flew. Then, shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, several colonists lay dead. The Boston Massacre, as it would soon be called, shocked the colonies. Though small in scale, the incident had enormous symbolic power. Colonial newspapers spread dramatic accounts, portraying the fallen as martyrs to tyranny. Engravings depicted British soldiers firing mercilessly into an unarmed crowd. The truth was complex, but perception mattered more than facts. Trust between the colonies and Britain shattered further. Still, even after blood was spilled, many colonists clung to hope. They believed violence could still be avoided. Leaders urged restraint, arguing that rash action would destroy any chance of reconciliation. The struggle returned briefly to words, but the tone had changed. Anger now carried an edge. Then came the Tea Act. In an attempt to rescue the struggling British East India Company, Parliament granted it special privileges to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price. On paper, the tea was cheaper. In principle, it was unacceptable. Accepting it meant accepting Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Resistance exploded, not in chaos, but in careful planning. On a cold December night in 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor. Without harming a single person, they broke open hundreds of chests and dumped the tea into the dark water below. The Tea Party was a turning point. It was no longer a petition or a boycott. It was open defiance. The message was unmistakable. Colonial resistance had crossed a line, and there was no easy return. Britain's response was swift and unforgiving.
The coercive acts, known in the colonies as the intolerable acts, were designed to punish Massachusetts and intimidate the rest. Boston's port was closed, local government was dismantled, British authority expanded, and military power increased. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, these acts united the colonies. What happened in Boston could happen anywhere. Fear spread, but so did solidarity. Colonies sent supplies, letters of support, and delegates to discuss a common response. The First Continental Congress was formed, marking a new level of coordination and commitment. Meanwhile, local militias began to organize more seriously. These were not professional armies, but farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who trained in spare moments. They did not yet call themselves revolutionaries, but they prepared for the possibility of violence. The phrase "Minutemen" reflected readiness, the idea that resistance could be mobilized at a moment's notice. British authorities sensed the shift and grew alarmed. Intelligence suggested that colonists were stockpiling weapons. Orders were given to seize military supplies and arrest known leaders. These decisions, intended to prevent rebellion, instead ensured it. In April 1775, British troops marched toward the towns of Lexington and Concord. Their mission was simple: assert control. But the countryside was already awake. Riders spread warnings through the night. When British soldiers arrived, they were met not by submission, but by armed colonists standing their ground. No one knows who fired the first shot. What is known is what followed. Gunfire erupted. Blood was shed. The British retreated under constant attack. The war that had lived in words and ideas was now real. The first sparks of war did not ignite overnight. They were born from years of ignored voices, broken trust, and growing resolve. Peaceful protest had transformed into armed resistance, not because colonists desired war, but because they believed there was no other path left. When words turned into fire, America crossed a threshold. The struggle was no longer about negotiation. It was about survival, identity, and the right to choose its own future. The storm arrived. Battles that changed lives but united a cause. When the first shots were fired, the idea of war ceased to be theoretical. What had once lived in speeches, pamphlets, and whispered conversations now took shape in smoke, blood, and fear. The American colonies stood at the edge of an irreversible path. The soil that had promised opportunity and freedom was now stained with sacrifice. The early battles of the Revolutionary War were not grand displays of military precision. They were chaotic, uneven, and deeply personal. Farmers left their fields, blacksmiths set aside their tools, shopkeepers locked their doors, unsure if they would ever return. These men were not soldiers by trade. They were citizens driven by belief and necessity. At Lexington and Concord, the reality of war struck hard. The sound of gunfire echoed across quiet villages, shattering any remaining illusions. British troops, trained and disciplined, marched with confidence. Colonial militias, poorly equipped but fiercely determined, stood in their way. When the fighting ended, lives were lost on both sides, but something new had been born. Fear spread quickly through the colonies. News traveled faster than armies, carried by riders and word of mouth. Families gathered around hearths, listening in silence as reports of deaths and skirmishes reached them. Mothers feared for sons, wives feared for husbands. The cost of resistance was no longer abstract. It had names and faces. Yet fear did not weaken resolve. Instead, it hardened it. Each early battle carried emotional weight far beyond its military significance. The loss of a neighbor, a brother, or a friend transformed political disagreement into personal commitment. Grief became fuel. Mourning turned into motivation.
Colonists who had once hesitated now felt compelled to choose a side. The Battle of Bunker Hill was one such moment. Though technically a British victory, it proved something critical. The colonial forces could stand against the most powerful army in the world. British casualties were shockingly high. For the colonists, the message was clear. This fight was not hopeless. But victory came at a terrible price. Bodies lay scattered across fields and hillsides. The wounded cried out for help that often came too late. Medical knowledge was limited, supplies were scarce, and infection was a constant threat. Survival was uncertain even after the fighting stopped. Ordinary people bore the heaviest burden. Civilians found their homes turned into battlegrounds. Crops were destroyed, livestock seized, and towns occupied. Refugees fled with what little they could carry. War disrupted every aspect of daily life, blurring the line between soldier and civilian. Women played a crucial, often overlooked role during this time. They managed farms and businesses in the absence of men. They nursed the wounded, made clothing, prepared food, and kept communities alive. Some followed armies as camp followers, enduring the same hardships as soldiers. Their resilience became a quiet pillar of the revolution. Enslaved Africans faced impossible choices. Some sought freedom by escaping to British lines, lured by promises of emancipation. Others fought alongside colonial forces, hoping that liberty would extend to them as well. Native American tribes, caught between rival powers, struggled to survive in a conflict that threatened their land and way of life. The war's impact was vast and unequal, shaping destinies in different ways. Despite these divisions, a sense of unity began to emerge among the colonies. Shared suffering forged shared purpose. Men from different regions fought side by side, discovering common ground in hardship. Accents differed, customs varied, but the cause connected them. The idea of America grew stronger with every sacrifice. Leadership evolved under pressure. Figures who had once spoken cautiously now accepted the full weight of command. Decisions meant life or death. Mistakes were costly. Courage was demanded daily, not only on the battlefield, but in moments of doubt and despair. Supplies were scarce. Soldiers endured hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Many lacked proper uniforms or shoes. Winter camps tested endurance as much as combat did. Yet letters and journals reveal something remarkable. Belief endured even when conditions were unbearable. The cause sustained them when comfort could not. British forces, though superior in training and equipment, faced their own challenges. Fighting a distant war against a determined population proved far more difficult than expected. Each mile of unfamiliar terrain carried risk. Each town could hide resistance. Victory was no longer assured. As casualties mounted, the meaning of the struggle deepened. The war was no longer just about taxes or representation. It was about identity, dignity, and the right to decide one's future. Blood had been spilled, and with it came a commitment that could not easily be undone. Funerals became common. Flags draped coffins. Communities mourned together, reinforcing bonds that stretched across social lines. Loss created solidarity. Pain created purpose. The soil of America absorbed the blood of its people, but from that sacrifice grew unity. The revolution transformed from a political movement into a shared national experience. The cost was immense, but the cause was strengthened with every fallen life. Hope did not disappear. It changed. It became heavier, more realistic, shaped by loss. It was no longer naive optimism, but determined belief forged in suffering. The early battles did not decide the war, but they decided something just as important. They proved that the colonies were willing to endure unimaginable hardship for the chance to be free. They proved that unity could rise from fear. They proved that a cause worth dying for could also be a cause worth living for. Blood had been spilled on the soil of hope, and the land would never be the same.
Families broken, dreams shattered, and courage tested. War is often remembered through victories and defeats, through names of battles and dates written in history books. But behind every moment of triumph lies a quieter, deeper story, the story of loss. In the American struggle for independence, freedom demanded a price far greater than strategy or sacrifice on the battlefield. It demanded the breaking of families, the shattering of dreams, and the testing of human courage in its most fragile form. As the war stretched on, its burden fell heaviest on ordinary people. Soldiers marched away from their homes with uncertainty in their hearts, leaving behind families who could only wait and hope. Many never returned. For those who did, the war followed them home, etched into memory and spirit. Women became the backbone of survival. With husbands, fathers, and sons gone, they assumed roles once denied to them. They worked fields, managed shops, and negotiated debts. Their days were filled with exhaustion, their nights with fear. Yet they endured, driven by necessity and quiet strength. Some followed armies as nurses and cooks, witnessing horrors that would haunt them forever. Others stayed behind, holding households together with determination and faith. Children grew up too quickly. They learned the sound of distant gunfire and the meaning of hunger. Schools closed, routines vanished, and innocence was replaced by awareness. Many children were forced into labor to support their families. Others became messengers, carrying information across dangerous roads. Childhood, once a time of promise, became a lesson in survival. For soldiers, the physical hardship was relentless. Marches lasted for days, sometimes weeks, under brutal conditions. Food was scarce, clothing inadequate, and shelter unreliable. Disease spread faster than bullets, claiming lives silently. Wounds often meant slow, painful deaths. Medical care was primitive, and survival depended as much on luck as resilience. But the greatest wounds were often invisible. Fear, doubt, and despair shadowed every step. Soldiers wrote letters home, unsure if they would ever see their loved ones again. They questioned their choices in moments of exhaustion, wondering if freedom was worth the suffering. Yet even in their darkest hours, many held on to belief, not in certainty, but in hope. Farmers faced devastation on a different front. Fields became battlegrounds, crops were trampled, barns burned, and livestock taken by passing armies. Years of labor vanished overnight. For families who depended on the land, this loss threatened survival itself. Still, many farmers continued to support the cause, offering food and shelter despite the risk. The war fractured communities. Neighbors took opposing sides, dividing towns and even families. Loyalty to Britain remained strong among some, while others embraced independence. Accusations of betrayal led to exile, imprisonment, or violence. Trust dissolved, replaced by suspicion. The emotional toll of these divisions lingered long after the fighting ended. Enslaved Africans endured the war under constant uncertainty. Promises of freedom were made and broken by both sides. Some escaped, risking capture or death. Others remained enslaved, watching a revolution fought in the name of liberty pass them by. Their struggle exposed the contradictions at the heart of the cause. Native American tribes suffered immense loss. Caught between powerful forces, their lands became contested territory. Alliances offered little protection. Villages were destroyed, traditions disrupted, and futures erased. The war for American freedom often meant devastation for those who had lived on the land for generations.
Despite these hardships, courage emerged in unexpected ways. It appeared in a mother comforting her children during a siege, in a farmer rebuilding his home after it was burned, in a soldier standing firm despite fear. Courage was not always loud or heroic. It was often quiet, steady, and deeply human. Dreams were reshaped by war. Some were destroyed entirely. Young men who once imagined peaceful lives now carried scars. Families who dreamed of stability learned to accept uncertainty. Yet new dreams also formed, dreams of equality, self-rule, and a future shaped by choice rather than command. Faith sustained many through suffering. Churches, when still standing, offered solace and community. Prayer became a refuge when answers were scarce. Belief in a greater purpose helped people endure losses that might otherwise have broken them. As the war continued, freedom began to feel both closer and more distant. Each sacrifice brought hope, but also grief. The cost was undeniable. Independence was no longer an abstract ideal. It was something paid for in tears, blood, and broken lives. Yet it was precisely this cost that gave freedom its meaning. Those who suffered did not see themselves as victims alone. Many believed their hardship would spare future generations from similar pain. Their endurance was an investment in a future they might never see. The cost of freedom was measured not only in lives lost, but in lives altered forever. It tested humanity at every level, physically, emotionally, morally. And in that test, ordinary people revealed extraordinary strength. When the war finally ended, freedom would arrive not as celebration alone, but as remembrance. The scars would remain, reminders of what had been given up. But so would the courage that made independence possible.
When destiny shifted and victory seemed possible. For years, the American struggle for independence had felt like a test of endurance rather than a path toward victory. Losses were heavy, resources scarce, and hope fragile. Many believed the colonies could resist, but few dared to believe they could truly win. Then, slowly and almost unexpectedly, the tide began to turn. The turning point did not arrive with a single decisive blow. Instead, it emerged through a series of moments, strategic choices, hard-earned victories, and alliances that reshaped the balance of power. What once seemed like inevitable defeat began to transform into a future that felt possible. One of the critical shifts came with a change in leadership and strategy. The colonial forces learned painful lessons from early defeats. They could not fight the British Empire head-on in traditional European warfare. Instead, they adapted. Flexibility became their strength. Knowledge of the land, speed, and persistence allowed them to survive battles they were not meant to win outright. Leadership matured under pressure. Commanders understood that survival itself was a form of success. Avoiding destruction mattered more than capturing cities. Preserving the army meant preserving the revolution. This mindset kept hope alive during moments when collapse seemed imminent. The winter at Valley Forge became a defining chapter in this transformation. Soldiers endured brutal cold, hunger, and disease. Many lacked proper clothing and shelter. Yet instead of breaking the army, the hardships strengthened it. Training improved discipline. Shared suffering forged unity. When spring arrived, the army emerged more resilient, more confident, and more capable than before. Small victories carried enormous psychological weight. Each successful engagement proved that British forces were not invincible. Morale rose, not because the war was easy, but because progress, however limited, was visible. The idea of independence no longer felt like a dream sustained only by belief. It began to feel achievable. The most dramatic shift came with a victory that echoed far beyond American shores.
At the Battle of Saratoga, colonial forces achieved a success that stunned the world. British surrender there was more than a military triumph. It was a message. It demonstrated that the colonies could defeat a major British army in open conflict. This victory changed everything. Across the Atlantic, foreign powers watched closely. France, long a rival of Britain, saw opportunity. The American cause, once viewed as a desperate rebellion, now appeared as a legitimate movement with real potential. Diplomatic efforts intensified. Letters, envoys, and negotiations carried the story of American resistance to European courts. When France officially entered the war as an ally, the balance of power dramatically shifted. Financial aid, weapons, training, and naval support flowed toward the colonies. The struggle was no longer isolated, it had become international. Britain now faced a global conflict, stretching its resources and attention. French support did more than strengthen military capability, it strengthened belief. Soldiers and civilians alike saw the alliance as validation. The world was watching. The cause of independence was no longer ignored or dismissed, it was recognized. Other nations followed cautiously, offering indirect support. Supplies reached American forces through hidden channels. The war expanded beyond colonial borders, forcing Britain to reconsider its strategy. Victory was no longer guaranteed. Strategic coordination improved. Battles were planned with greater care. Intelligence networks expanded. Civilians contributed information, shelter, and resources. The line between soldier and supporter blurred as the entire population became part of the effort. Naval power emerged as a crucial factor. French fleets challenged British dominance at sea, disrupting supply lines and shifting control of key regions. For the first time, British forces found themselves constrained, unable to move freely or reinforce positions with ease. Hope spread through the colonies, not as blind optimism, but as cautious confidence. People began to imagine life after war. Conversations shifted from survival to possibility. What would independence look like? How would a new nation govern itself? These questions, once theoretical, now felt urgent and real. Yet the turning point did not eliminate fear or sacrifice. Battles continued, losses mounted, victory remained uncertain, but the nature of uncertainty changed. Defeat was no longer assumed. Success was no longer unimaginable. The emotional shift was profound. Soldiers fought not only to resist, but to win. Civilians endured hardship with renewed purpose. Each sacrifice felt connected to a future that might truly exist. British confidence began to erode. Fighting a determined population across unfamiliar terrain, now supported by foreign powers, proved costly. The empire faced pressure at home and abroad. The war that was supposed to restore order had become a drain on strength and morale. As the conflict evolved, destiny seemed to tilt. History rarely moves in straight lines, but moments arrive when direction becomes clear. The American Revolution reached such a moment. The struggle was no longer just about defiance, it was about transformation. The turning point did not end the war, but it changed its meaning. Independence was no longer a distant hope whispered in fear. It was a goal pursued with strategy, support, and growing confidence. For the first time, victory seemed possible. And once a people truly believe they can win, the course of history is never the same. Independence, identity, and the dream of a free nation. Revolutions do not succeed by force alone. They require something far more powerful, an idea strong enough to unite sacrifice, suffering, and hope into a shared vision of the future. For the American colonies, that idea was independence. It was not merely the rejection of British rule, but the birth of a new identity and a daring experiment in self-government. By the mid-1770s, the question facing the colonies was no longer whether they were being treated unjustly. That truth had become undeniable. The question now was whether they were ready to imagine something entirely new. Independence demanded more than courage on the battlefield. It demanded clarity of purpose and belief in a future that had never existed before. The idea of breaking away from one of the most powerful empires in the world was terrifying. For generations, colonists had lived as British subjects. The empire had shaped their laws, culture, and sense of order. To reject it meant stepping into uncertainty. There was no guarantee that independence would lead to stability. Failure could mean chaos, foreign domination, or total collapse. Yet the idea would not disappear. Across the colonies, conversations changed tone. What had once been whispered cautiously was now spoken openly. Town meetings debated self-rule. Newspapers questioned monarchy itself. Pamphlets argued that liberty was not a privilege granted by kings, but a natural right belonging to all people. At the center of this intellectual transformation stood the Declaration of Independence. When the document was drafted, it did more than announce separation from Britain. It explained why separation was necessary. It spoke not only to Parliament or the king, but to the world and to history. Its words carried moral weight, framing the revolution as a defense of universal principles rather than a local dispute. We hold these truths to be self-evident. With that single line, a radical idea was made permanent. Equality was declared not as an aspiration, but as a truth. Government, the document argued, existed to protect the rights of the people. When it failed to do so, it lost its legitimacy. Authority flowed upward from the governed, not downward from a throne. This was a new way of thinking. For many colonists, hearing the Declaration read aloud in public squares was a moment of awakening. Bells rang, crowds gathered. Some celebrated, others wept, and many stood in stunned silence. The words gave shape to feelings they had carried for years. They transformed resistance into purpose. For many colonists, hearing the Declaration read aloud in public squares was a moment of awakening. Bells rang, crowds gathered. Some celebrated, others wept, and many stood in stunned silence. The words gave shape to feelings they had carried for years. They transformed resistance into purpose. Independence also forced colonists to confront who they were becoming. No longer British subjects, they were now Americans, though that identity was still forming. The colonies were diverse, divided by region, religion, and economic interest. Unity was fragile. The dream of a single nation required imagination as much as agreement. The idea of a republic, a government without a king, was bold and untested. Monarchies dominated the world. The belief that ordinary people could govern themselves was seen by many as reckless. Critics warned that democracy would lead to disorder, mob rule, or tyranny of another kind. But supporters argued that self-rule was not only possible, it was necessary. They believed that freedom demanded participation, responsibility, and accountability. Power concentrated in one ruler had proven dangerous. A government shaped by laws, representation, and consent offered a different path. The dream of equality, however, was complicated. While the Declaration spoke of universal rights, reality fell short. Enslaved Africans remained in bondage. Women were excluded from political participation. Native Americans were pushed aside. The new idea contained both promise and contradiction. Yet even these contradictions mattered. By stating ideals so boldly, the revolution planted seeds that would grow over generations. The language of equality created a standard by which future injustices could be challenged. The idea was imperfect but powerful. As independence took shape, debates over governance intensified. How much power should the central authority hold? How could liberty be protected without inviting chaos? These questions had no easy answers. The colonies were building a nation while fighting for survival. Despite uncertainty, belief endured. Soldiers fought with renewed purpose, knowing what they were fighting for, not just against. Civilians endured hardship with a sense of participation in history. Sacrifice felt connected to meaning. Internationally, independence changed how the world viewed the conflict. The colonies were no longer rebels seeking concessions. They were a people claiming nationhood. Foreign powers responded differently, engaging with America as a political entity rather than a rebellion. The birth of a new idea also reshaped the individual. Ordinary people began to see themselves as citizens, not subjects. Responsibility replaced obedience. Participation replaced submission. This shift in mindset was as revolutionary as any battle. Identity transformed slowly. Flags, symbols, and shared language reinforced belonging. We, the people, became more than words. It became an aspiration. Americans began to imagine a future shaped by choice rather than command. The dream of a free nation was fragile, threatened by war, division, and doubt, but it endured because it offered something no empire could provide: ownership of destiny. Independence meant the freedom to fail, but also the freedom to succeed on one's own terms. The revolution had begun as resistance to injustice. It evolved into something far greater, a reimagining of power, rights, and identity. The birth of this new idea did not end the struggle. In many ways, it only began it. But once spoken aloud, once written and declared, the idea could not be undone.
Power struggles, broken promises, and new challenges. Victory brought celebration, relief, and pride, but it did not bring peace of mind. When the war ended and independence was secured, the American people faced a sobering truth: winning freedom was only the beginning. Building a nation would test them in ways the battlefield never had. The empire had fallen away, but what would replace it was uncertain. The newly independent states emerged from the war exhausted and deeply divided. Years of conflict had drained resources, disrupted trade, and left communities fractured. Soldiers returned home to ruined farms and unpaid wages. Cities struggled to recover. The promise of freedom felt real, but fragile. Politically, the young nation was uneasy. The colonies had united to fight a common enemy, but unity was harder to sustain without one. Each state guarded its independence fiercely, wary of replacing British tyranny with centralized American authority. The fear of concentrated power ran deep. The first system of governance reflected this anxiety. The national government was intentionally weak, designed to avoid the abuses of monarchy. But weakness came with consequences. The government struggled to raise money, regulate trade, or enforce laws. Decisions required agreement among states with competing interests, and consensus was rare. Economic problems soon dominated daily life. War debt weighed heavily on the nation. The government owed money to foreign allies, merchants, and soldiers. Taxes were inconsistent and often unpopular. Farmers lost land. Veterans who had fought for independence found themselves poor and forgotten. For many, the promises of the revolution felt broken. Protests erupted as frustration grew. Ordinary citizens questioned whether the new leaders truly represented them. Armed uprisings revealed deep dissatisfaction, not with independence itself, but with how it was being managed. The ideals that had inspired the revolution now challenged the nation to live up to them. Power struggles intensified among political leaders. Different visions of America competed for dominance. Some believed in a strong central government capable of maintaining order and economic stability. Others feared that such power would undermine liberty and recreate the very tyranny they had overthrown. These debates were fierce, personal, and often bitter.
Alliances shifted, accusations flew, newspapers fueled division. Political disagreement, once directed against Britain, now turned inward. The challenge was philosophical as much as practical. What did democracy truly mean? How much power should the people have? How could freedom be protected without descending into chaos? There were no clear answers, only experiments. Economic inequality complicated matters further. While some benefited from new opportunities, many remained trapped in poverty. Enslaved Africans continued to live without freedom, exposing a painful contradiction between revolutionary ideals and reality. Native American lands were increasingly threatened by expansion, even as liberty was celebrated. Women, too, faced disappointment. Though they had played critical roles during the war, their political rights remained limited. The promise of equality had not yet reached them. Freedom, it seemed, was unevenly distributed. Yet, despite disillusionment, the nation did not collapse. Debate, though divisive, was also proof of something new: the right to argue openly about the future. Power was no longer absolute. Authority could be questioned. Leaders could be challenged without fear of execution. Slowly, painfully, solutions were sought. Leaders gathered to reconsider the structure of government. The goal was balance, to create authority strong enough to function, yet restrained enough to protect liberty. Compromise became a necessity, even when it was uncomfortable. The result was a new framework for governance, one that divided power, limited authority, and placed trust in institutions rather than individuals. It was imperfect, shaped by fear and hope alike, but it represented commitment to the ideals born during the Revolution. The struggle to protect those ideals continued beyond politics. Citizens learned that freedom required participation. Voting, debate, and civic responsibility became part of national identity. Democracy was no longer an event, it was a process. Failures were inevitable, promises were delayed, some were broken entirely. But the willingness to confront these failures mattered. The nation was learning how to correct itself, even when correction was slow. The test after victory revealed a fundamental truth: independence did not guarantee justice, prosperity, or unity. It offered opportunity and responsibility. The revolution had removed external control, but it could not remove human weakness. And yet, the experiment endured. What held the nation together was not perfection, but belief. Belief that the ideals of liberty, representation, and equality, however incomplete, were worth defending. Belief that a nation could evolve without abandoning its principles. The struggle shifted from overthrowing an empire to holding oneself accountable. The revolution had taught Americans how to resist oppression. The years after victory taught them something harder: how to govern themselves. Power was no longer the enemy, it was a test. A nation tested after victory discovered that freedom was not a destination, but a responsibility passed from generation to generation. And the greatest challenge was not winning independence, but proving worthy of it.
How the past continues to define the present. History is not only the story of what has been, it is also the lens through which the present is understood and the foundation upon which the future is built. The American Revolution, fought centuries ago, did more than create a nation. Its echoes still reverberate across every street, every institution, and every citizen of the United States today. Freedom, once won at such high cost, remains a living, evolving experiment. The ideals that inspired colonists, liberty, equality, representation, and self-determination, have continued to challenge the nation to reconcile aspiration with reality. Every law, every social movement, and every debate about justice is a conversation with the past. The sacrifice of those who fought for independence serves as a moral compass. Soldiers endured unimaginable hardship, families suffered silently, and communities were forever altered. Modern Americans inherit not only the benefits of that struggle, but also the responsibility to honor it through civic engagement, empathy, and reflection. Institutions, both governmental and social, bear the marks of revolutionary ideals. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the system of checks and balances were born out of the desire to prevent tyranny while empowering the people. These structures are not relics, they are tools. They continue to be tested, adapted, and interpreted as society confronts new challenges. The past reminds citizens that liberty is never guaranteed. Rights can be expanded, threatened, or ignored. From debates over civil rights to discussions on gender equality, the legacy of the revolution informs the struggle for justice. Every protest, reform, and court decision is, in some way, a dialogue with history, an effort to align modern life with the principles that birthed the nation. Education carries the lessons forward. Schools teach children not only facts and dates, but the deeper meaning of courage, sacrifice, and critical thinking. Stories of ordinary men and women, farmers, thinkers, nurses, and soldiers remind young Americans that history is shaped by action as much as by ideas. The narrative of freedom becomes a personal inheritance, urging each generation to contribute to its ongoing story. Yet the echoes are complex. America's early ideals were imperfectly applied. Slavery, displacement of Native Americans, and the exclusion of women from political life show the contradictions that have persisted. Acknowledging these truths is not an act of diminishing history, but a recognition that the revolution was both inspiring and flawed. Learning from its failures is essential to building a more just society. The spirit of questioning authority, central to the revolution, continues to influence political and social engagement. Americans debate policy, challenge institutions, and demand accountability because their forebears demonstrated that active participation is essential for sustaining freedom. Independence was never meant to be passive. It requires vigilance. Cultural identity, too, carries revolutionary echoes. National symbols, the flag, the anthem, and monuments serve as reminders of a shared history. They evoke pride and reflection simultaneously. Festivals, speeches, and commemorations honor sacrifice while reinforcing the values upon which the nation was founded. Technological and social change tests these lessons in new ways. Issues that could not have been imagined in the 18th century, digital rights, mass communication, and global interdependence still require Americans to navigate the balance between liberty and responsibility. The revolution's core message that individuals have the power and duty to shape their government remains strikingly relevant. Economic challenges also reflect this continuity. Just as early Americans wrestled with scarcity, trade disruption, and inequality, contemporary society must address systemic inequities and ensure that prosperity benefits all citizens. Independence established the principle that citizens should have the ability to pursue opportunity, but it did not guarantee its uniform distribution. Each generation must interpret and apply that principle anew. Social justice movements echo the revolution in tone and intent. From abolition to women's suffrage, civil rights, and ongoing calls for equity, Americans have continually drawn inspiration from the founding ideals. These movements affirm that freedom is not a static achievement, but a living commitment, a dialogue between history and the present. The revolution also teaches humility. Great ideals demand hard work, compromise, and patience. Nation building is never straightforward. Independence brought the joy of freedom, but it also imposed responsibility, requiring Americans to navigate disagreement, govern fairly, and protect the vulnerable. The past illustrates that liberty without vigilance can erode, and that democracy is maintained not by assumption, but by constant care. For individuals, the echoes of the revolution invite reflection on values, priorities, and civic duty. Voting, participating in community decisions, advocating for change, and educating oneself are contemporary forms of honoring the struggle.
Everyday choices, small acts of courage, and the defense of rights continue the story begun centuries ago. Global perspective further reinforces this legacy. Other nations have studied and sometimes emulated the American experiment, recognizing that freedom and self-governance require courage, resilience, and vision. The revolution became a model, but also a reminder: liberty is hard-won, fragile, and continuous. At the heart of these echoes is a simple truth: history shapes the imagination as much as it shapes reality. Americans live with inherited ideals, obligations, and lessons. Independence is celebrated not simply as a historical event, but as an ongoing project, a charge for each citizen to uphold, refine, and advance. As the nation grows, diversifies, and evolves, the voices of the past remain relevant. They speak of courage in the face of oppression, sacrifice for collective good, and belief in the potential of ordinary people to shape extraordinary outcomes. These lessons remind Americans that freedom is both a gift and a duty. For future generations, the story carries both inspiration and warning. The foundation of liberty is firm, but its preservation requires awareness, commitment, and participation. History shows that complacency can erode rights, while engagement sustains them. The Revolutionary Era serves as a guide. Freedom is a task, not a guarantee. Even in the 21st century, the ideals of 1776 resonate. Debates over justice, governance, equality, and responsibility are alive in every classroom, courtroom, town hall, and home. Americans continue to grapple with the tension between principle and practice, a tension present since the earliest days of independence. The past is alive in these moments. Every choice made in the present reflects echoes from the Revolution. Every effort to expand opportunity, protect liberty, and seek justice continues a legacy begun centuries ago. Ultimately, the story of America is unfinished. Independence set the stage, but the nation's journey is ongoing. Its principles demand reinterpretation, application, and defense. Citizens inherit not just freedom, but the responsibility to use it wisely. The American Revolution did not end with victory on the battlefield. It continues in the questions Americans ask, the choices they make, and the ideals they pursue. Its echoes shape every aspect of civic life, reminding each generation that liberty, justice, and equality are responsibilities to be actively maintained. And so, the past lives in the present, teaching that freedom is not merely won once, it is renewed, protected, and defined by those who carry its promise forward.